Today on the podcast, we have our monthly update, our look not only at key pieces of news, but an examination of what they mean for Disney in the near future. Over the last month, the Disney company has changed in interesting ways. We'll talk about how the pandemic reshaped how Americans relate to film. We'll look at some interesting challenges that the Galactic Star Cruiser, now that it's open, will face in the coming months. We'll look at how Disney is changing its image to align more with world culture. And we'll explore how a large wave of pandemic restrictions, now fading away, allows the resorts to inch a bit more toward normal operations. In other words, we've got a lot to talk about. But before I jump in, I need to mention that allergies have been crazy bad this year. Out here in California, we had a massive rainstorm back in December, which brought much-needed rain. But now there's also a high level of pollen in the atmosphere. I know my voice, because of this, is a little ragged. Some sentences are going to be a little rough today. My voice may crack here and there, but we're just going to roll with it. We're going to dive into the news and analysis and focus on all of the interesting things out there. And hope that, pollen-wise, things are better in a week or two. So if you've got your earbuds in, if you've got your cruise control set, if you have a latte in the cup holder, here we go. So let's start with this. What will we be watching after the pandemic is over? Since Christmas, we've begun to see how the past 2 years have changed the media landscape and will continue to change it even after COVID restrictions go away. So the interesting question here is, what will we be watching and where once the pandemic is fully over? And for our podcast, there's this other question. What is Disney most likely to produce in the coming years, and where will it be released? It's no big surprise that the domestic box office has taken a big hit during the last 2 years. But if you dig into that data, the trends also suggest how the movie experience will change in the coming months and years. There has been one genuine hit in the last 3 months, and only one, which is Spider-Man: No Way Home. It took in $780 million at the U.S. box office, eclipsing 2019's Far From Home, which took in $390 million, and 2017's Homecoming, which took in $334 million. But elsewhere, the picture of the domestic box office doesn't look nearly as bright. Sing 2, which was reasonably well reviewed, took in $151 million compared to 2016's original Sing film, which took in $270. Kenneth Branagh's Death in the Nile, another reasonably well-reviewed movie, took in just $32 million. This movie was a sequel of sorts to Kenneth Branagh's Murder on the Orient Express, released in 2017, which took in $107 million. Likewise, Jackass Forever took in just $53 million, while the previous Jackass movie took in $117 million. The latest in the Kingsman franchise took in just $37 million, while the one before it took in $100 million. If you simply subtract out that interesting outlier, Spider-Man: No Way Home, from the mix, by pretty much every other metric, the American box office remains significantly depressed, even for films directed at young adult audiences, which is the one demographic that in these late pandemic times is most likely to venture to an indoor theater. This past week, on an earnings call, Cinemark's CEO, Sean Gamble, admitted, quote, "There continues to be an evolution and things to sort out coming out of the pandemic in terms of just changing consumer behaviors, expectations, things of that sort." In other words, he recognized that the pandemic, now over 2 years old, has changed how Americans engage film. The move away from cinema experiences is also reflected in Cinemark's stock price. At the start of 2020, just before the pandemic, Cinemark's stock price was $34. Now it's half that at $17. Gamble was optimistic about big-budget films like The Batman about to arrive in theaters, but also suggested that blockbusters alone wouldn't be able to support the American theater system at anywhere near pre-pandemic levels. One of the problems is that older Americans simply aren't returning to theaters in large numbers, largely due to concerns about COVID in indoor spaces. Likewise, producers of smaller or mid-budget films are unwilling to engage the marketing expense of a theatrical release, especially when box office returns have been low, and those same producers are finding attractive offers by placing films directly on Netflix and other streaming services. In short, producers of low and mid-budget films have found better deals by selling directly to Netflix, Amazon, and other streaming services. And as these relationships become more established, it becomes more likely that these relationships will continue even after the pandemic is over. But Gamble at Cinemark remained optimistic that some of those smaller or mid-budget films would return to big screens in coming months, though of course this has yet to happen in any meaningful way. Gamble was hopeful that a revised exclusive release window might lure small films back into theaters, which was the largest contractual change between studios and theaters that happened during the pandemic. Before the pandemic, theaters essentially had 90 days to show a film before a studio could contractually release it to home video, and about 75 days before it could be released on any digital platform. Theaters essentially owned screening rights to a film for 3 months, and if you wanted to see that film during those 3 months, you went to the theater. The new exclusive window is shorter, but has yet to settle into an industry-wide standard. Warner Brothers and Paramount have agreed to a 45-day exclusive window. Universal has 2 models, 17 days for smaller budget films and 31 days for big budget films. Some of the content that Disney oversaw for fall went out with a negotiated 45-day exclusive window, such as The Eternals, whereas Encanto was released on November 24th, and 30 days later, on December 24th, it showed up on Disney+. Sean Gamble suggested that the shortened exclusive window might make it more profitable for studios to release films to a theater before moving them quickly onto a streaming service or a digital platform, allowing the marketing cost of a theatrical release to directly feed into promotion for a digital presentation. Quote, "The actual risk factor associated with that has actually improved because of the more dynamic window," Gamble said. "So I think there's the potential over time that we may start to see more of the smaller and mid-tier films getting released theatrically, which could balance out the mix." But this, I would say, is a hopeful view as to how business might improve for theaters. Producers might simply find that it's still more lucrative to sell directly to a streaming service so it can be advertised as a Netflix or Amazon exclusive. The 2 areas where theaters have gained back some ground are with tentpole releases such as Spider-Man and The Batman, and with animated movies directed at families and children. Sing 2 underperformed compared to the original Sing movie, but it still performed a whole lot better than nearly everything else released in the last 6 months, except for Spider-Man, Venom, and Shang-Chi. And none of this is that surprising. Studios will continue to take on the risk and expense of a theatrical release for similar movies, and Disney is leaning hard into this strategy. In the coming months, franchise films such as Lightyear and all the Marvel titles will premiere in theaters, while nearly everything else arranged for families is being released directly to Disney+, including Turning Red, Cheaper by the Dozen, Rescue Rangers, Disenchanted, and Hocus Pocus 2. If you subtract Fox out of the mix and just look at the remaining Disney centers, from Pixar to Star Wars to Marvel to Disney Animation, back in 2019, the last year before the pandemic, these divisions together released 10 movies to theaters. In 2022, there are presently just 5 such features earmarked for traditional release. But changes in theatrical releases are only half of the story here, and the other half, how streaming is changing film stories, is the more interesting part. In terms of how streaming has changed viewer habits over the pandemic, there are two areas to look at. The first is pretty straightforward. During the pandemic, Americans, or at least a lot of them, became accustomed to staying at home and watching movies. This almost certainly means that theaters, particularly the multiplexes, are overbuilt for how Americans will use them once the pandemic is fully over. But the other question is more intriguing. How has streaming changed the ways that Americans relate to filmed stories? Due to the finances of producing a studio project, for decades, big-budget films needed to be stories that lasted between 90 minutes and 2.5 hours, so they could be effectively shown in a theater. This was the only viable way to recoup the tens or hundreds of millions of dollars that went into the production of a studio spectacular. But this was also an artificial time constraint. The length of the story was dictated by the most effective way for the film to produce a profit. Large distribution movies needed to be arranged as entertainment for a single evening. But streaming, and more importantly, all of the money that's woven into streaming, lifted that artificial limitation and allowed film stories to exist at different lengths, with other ways to arrange film stories outside of projects first released to a cinema. American interest in film projects have moved from a 90-minute production to longer and more involved presentations. If I consider those productions that have had the largest cultural impact in the last few years, I'd easily point to mini streaming series, from WandaVision to The Mandalorian to Loki to The Queen's Gambit to Squid Games and so on. WandaVision, in ways, functions like a 6-hour movie. Both Loki and The Falcon and the Winter Soldier come in at about 4.5 hours. The Queen's Gambit is also hovering around 6 hours. Simply, Americans are migrating toward longer forms of filmed stories that offer deeper characterization, greater complexity in plot, and longer viewing times to create a stronger personal connection with the world presented in the story. And this, of course, is a problem for American cinemas, because cinemas are not the most convenient venue for a 4, 5, or 6-hour story. The home is a far more comfortable place to engage a story of that length. And here's where we can start to see what the future of Disney and Disney-produced film stories likely holds. We've already talked about how studios, including Disney, will continue to produce some 90-minute to 2-hour films for theaters. And this means that Disney will continue to produce stories in this time range for Star Wars, Avatar, Marvel, and some high-level projects directed at families such as Lightyear. And the hits and misses over at Disney Plus so far also lay out the direction that the streaming service will likely take in the coming years as well. Disney has consciously arranged itself to compete with the industry leader Netflix, and in some areas Disney Plus is performing well, in other areas less so. One area of strength is focused on movie-length projects, essentially standalone films between 90 minutes and 2 hours. In the most recent week of Nielsen ratings, Disney has 5 of the top 10 streaming movies, 3 of them being recent titles: Encanto, The Adventures of Buck Wild, and The Eternals, and 2 of them older catalog films, Moana and Frozen. If anything, this suggests that Frozen and Moana have the type of staying power that will continue to translate into projects for the theme parks. Nielsen has also estimated that 40% of the audience for Encanto is between 2 and 11 years old. So we're looking at a younger demographic for these standalone films. These efforts overall are working well for Disney. You can expect to see more filmed projects like these directed at younger audiences, as this is one important way that families are using the Disney Plus streaming service. In the coming months, film-length animated or partially animated projects such as Turning Red and Rescue Rangers will premiere as Disney Plus originals, and this will continue to anchor this area of strength for the streaming service. But over on the original series side, for the most recent week posted, Disney Plus has only one entry on that top 10 list, the limited series The Book of Boba Fett. Everything else on that top 10 list, from Cobra Kai to Ozark, belongs to Netflix. And this, I suspect, is the area that Disney is going to more robustly target in future years, creating limited series for a slightly older audience to go head-to-head with Netflix in this category, as these longer programs are likely going to be more of a meaningful center point of American viewing habits as we move forward. Also, there's an added benefit to these longer programs, such as The Mandalorian, in terms of how streaming material may allow viewers to develop stronger attachments to the characters and situations, which may then have the possibility of creating material for the theme parks, more so than a one-shot 90-minute film that is streamed at home. As you look at what's been announced for Disney Plus, you can see the company pivoting in this direction, though there are still a number of 90-minute movies. Largely targeted for younger viewers, the company is creating more limited series for that slightly older audience interested in longer stories. Nearly everything announced for Marvel on Disney Plus follows this model, from Secret Invasion to Miss Marvel. Nearly everything announced or teased for Lucasfilm on Disney Plus also follows this model, from Andor to Obi-Wan to The Acolyte to Lando. In this, we're seeing Disney shift into a new type of story production, one that is partially freed from the artificial time constraints of the cinema model. The standalone 2-hour films being developed for Disney Plus, with only a couple of exceptions such as Hocus Pocus 2, are all directed at younger and family audiences. But beyond that, the company is recognizing that for older viewers, let's say age 12 and up, limited series in which viewers engage the story over 6 to 10 episodes are going to be a large part of how we as a culture engage filmed stories in the near future. And this philosophy, that Disney believes its audience wants longer and more involved story experiences, lines up with how other divisions in the company are arranging future projects. The Galactic Star Cruiser is, in essence, a 2-day theme park experience in which guests participate in the creation of the story, as opposed to previous theme park attractions in which guests move through a movie-like environment. The Galactic Star Cruiser uses set design, special effects, costuming, ride elements, and actors to develop a theme park-style experience focused on one intellectual property that lasts nearly 2 days. There are a lot of questions circling around the Star Cruiser, most notably, after initial curiosity about the project dies down, will the resort be able to fill rooms at $5,000 or $6,000 per stay? And then the other question, are there enough visitors who want to become part of the story, as opposed to simply watching the story unfold around them? And this question goes back to the early days of theme parks. A few years ago, I wrote a book called 3 Years in Wonderland, which looked at the development and construction of Disneyland in the early 1950s. At the center of this book were two people, Walt Disney, of course, and the park's first president, C.B. Wood. These two men had many differences, some of them explosive, but they also understood theme parks to function in two different ways. Walt Disney wanted rich detail in his park because he thought guests would want to come and role-play inside of movie regions. In those early days, Frontierland had bad guys, a sheriff, and daily gun battles, bits of street theater in which guests could participate. Walt Disney believed that the added detail would help guests leave their regular lives behind and role-play in the Wild West, or with the street characters over on Main Street, or in the exotic areas of Adventureland. That is, Walt Disney believed that guests would want to participate in the story. C.V. Wood, on the other hand, believed that guests would be fascinated with Disneyland, but a rich level of detail wasn't necessary because he believed that guests would primarily want to watch the story play out around them. In his vision, guests at Disneyland wouldn't be participants in the story. They would simply be an audience, interested in the drama that unfolded around them. For decades, these two philosophies have been the two poles of themed amusements. Some attractions ask guests to participate in the story, while other attractions, actually far more attractions, ask guests to simply sit there and passively observe the wonders around them. And now, nearly 70 years after Woody and Walt parted ways, and after America has developed a more intimate relationship with its entertainment, these two philosophies are again being tested. How much does the Disney audience want to be part of the creation of the story, and how much does it simply want to sit back and be entertained? There are other factors, of course, in the unique project of the Galactic Star Cruiser, which we'll talk about later. But this is one of the largest ones. Where are we in 2022 in terms of how we relate to entertainment? And that, in ways, brings us back to the main point of this featured segment. Box office numbers, streaming rankings, and announced projects, at least in terms of film, suggest that Disney is moving aggressively into film projects that need to be viewed at home due to their length. Film projects where viewers will engage longer and more complex relationships with the characters and situations they see on screen. And that, in this moment, is the future of film, at least as it relates to Disney. The Galactic Star Cruiser has been open for a week now, and I'm guessing that you've seen videos and photos of the experience. Trip reports of the Star Cruiser have been so widely distributed online that I'm not even sure it would be that interesting at this point to talk about them. My Facebook feed is pretty much an endless scroll of Star Cruiser reports. My guess is that you've already seen photos and videos and have probably read a handful of reviews as well. Much of the discussion about the Star Cruiser revolves around pricing, but that issue aside, I think there's a lot to celebrate in this project. The Galactic Star Cruiser is a genuine departure from the types of projects developed by Imagineering in recent years, and I'm generally a fan of creative risk. I'd rather see something that represents a new category of experience than an attraction that tacks more safely to convention. Risk is how any creative industry grows. In this area, I think there's a lot to admire. Years ago, the intermediate plans for Galaxy's Edge, the Star Wars themed area at Disneyland and Hollywood Studios, incorporated a deeper sense of interactive play, a sense of play that was slowly removed from the finished land, in part due to the daily cost of acting talent required to create such experiences. With the Star Cruiser, we have an opportunity to see how these levels of interactive play will connect with guests. Part of the barrier here, as mentioned above, is price. Price is wholly, or at least almost wholly, a function of commerce, not a function of art. Art is what you can imagine and create. Art is a vision that is realized in some physical form. Commerce is the amount of money that you can charge for it. And I hope many people, even if they're concerned by price, can at least separate out those elements that are tied to commerce from those that are tied to artistic innovation and creative invention. Most importantly, the creation of the Star Cruiser presents another possible path, that of creative play, that theme parks might more aggressively engage in subsequent years. This, I think, can be a starting point for a new category of experience. Think of an adventure where you and a group of strangers have an hour to escape from a recreation of Jurassic World, something like a massive escape room but with dinosaurs, or an evening where you move through the Forbidden Forest collecting items that need to be delivered to Hagrid. Something like a scavenger hunt, but with unicorn centaurs, dementors, buckbeak, and maybe, depending on the Harry Potter year that this adventure takes place, Aragog and his giant eight-legged friends. Or an afternoon in Wakanda, where using experimental technology, you protect the reserve of vibranium from smugglers. Like laser tag, but with holographic displays, remote control aircraft, underground tunnels, and the opportunity to march alongside the Dora Milaje. This, I think, is the larger element that's being tested in the Starcruiser project. How willing is a theme park audience in 2022 to engage something that is a combination of stagecraft, a traditional attraction, and a live-action role-playing game? And this will be fascinating to follow. But there's another area here, one that I think would be interesting to talk about, namely how a high-price role-playing project will change how Disney World markets and identifies itself. For 50 years, Disney World has essentially followed the same promotion and development playbook. Going back to 1973, during the resort's third year, it began to add new attractions to the Magic Kingdom to increase visitor interest and to entice previous visitors to return. In 1973, the Florida resort opened Pirates of the Caribbean. In 1975, Space Mountain. In 1980, Big Thunder, and so on. Each of these large attractions increased attendance for a time, and then another new attraction needed to be added to keep the frontline offerings fresh. Or to look at this from another perspective, construction allows Disney to focus its advertising on a new attraction, but then after a certain amount of time, that new attraction is no longer new and becomes part of the familiar experience of visiting the park. This has worked well for decades. An attraction, while it's new, is the focus of promotion, and then, sometime later, it becomes a perennial attraction guests enjoy for decades. In 1975, Disney World focused its yearly ad campaign around Space Mountain. It's hard to imagine Disney focusing a whole ad campaign around Space Mountain today, though it's still an attraction many guests enjoy each time they visit the park. And here's an interesting question. How long does it take for the newness to wear off from a theme park attraction? About 10 years ago, a European researcher specializing in hospitality explored how long a new attraction positively increased attendance at a typical amusement park. His conclusion, quote, "This positive influence lasted for no more than 2 years." This means that, on average, a new attraction, if it's well received, will persuade more people to visit a theme park for up to 2 years after it's opened. So right now, Remy's Ratatouille Adventure, along with Harmonious, helps attract guests to Epcot. But over at Animal Kingdom, slightly older attractions, such as Flight of Passage, are now viewed as perennial staples that help define the park but don't draw substantial increased interest in attending. This suggests, assuming the public's interest in the Galactic Starcruiser mimics that of a typical attraction, that the Starcruiser has about 2 years of strong interest before a good deal of its newness wears off. If it were a traditional attraction inside of a park such as Flight of Passage, this wouldn't be a problem. Guests would still line up for it each day as it's included in the price of admission. But 2 years from now, when, according to that European study, the Galactic Starcruiser will no longer feel new, it will still need to attract guests willing to pay $5,000 or $6,000 for the experience. And this, I think, is going to be a fundamental challenge in terms of maintaining this category of experience. The Starcruiser is also a fundamentally different type of Disney project. Disney World has always had add-on experiences, everything from specialty tours to boat rentals to surf lessons to scuba adventures inside the Seas Pavilion. But none of these experiences has been marketed as the center point activity of a vacation. And they've all been priced in such a way so that if you wanted, you could do them more than once. For example, I've met many people who've strapped on a scuba entertainment tank more than once for a dive quest at the Seas Pavilion. At $175, it's not cheap, but it's also not so highly priced that if it were your favorite experience at the resort, it would be prohibitively expensive to do on more than one Disney World vacation. But the Star Cruiser moves against both of these long-standing elements of Disney promotion. Because of the nature of the experience and the cost of cast members and equity actors to staff the ship, the Star Cruiser will always need to be promoted as a centerpiece experience. Equity actors, that is, professional actors organized under a union, are paid far more than frontline cast members, and there's a lot of them arranged into the Star Cruiser experience. Because of this, the Star Cruiser can never shift into a perennial experience, such as with Space Mountain. And because of the cost to stay on the Star Cruiser, the experience will be prohibitive for nearly everyone to enjoy more than once, and for many, it will be prohibitive to even enjoy just once. So in this, there's an interesting question. How will Disney arrange the Star Cruiser so that 2 years from now, families are as interested in spending $5,000 or $6,000 on the experience as they are today? Does there need to be a new story every 2 years or a new set of effects, or is the identity of the Star Cruiser going to change? I know a number of people have suggested that the Star Cruiser, if demand eventually goes down for the 2-day experience, could become a deluxe hotel. But I think there's little chance of this happening. The Star Cruiser is not built for that. The rooms are far too small. Disney hasn't released square footage, but the standard cabin is somewhere around 240 square feet, which is slightly smaller than a budget room at Pop Century. The small rooms are designed to increase the sense of actually being on a spacecraft. Beyond this, there's no leisure amenities such as a pool or a fitness center, or enticing transportation such as a boat, skyliner, or monorail to other areas of the resort. And the prospect of being indoors in a building with no windows for more than a couple of days would be daunting for most people. So this can't really be a deluxe hotel. The Star Cruiser is built for a specific purpose, which is a Star Wars-themed role-playing experience. So how will the company keep promoting the Star Cruiser as though it's a frontline attraction? That, I think, is going to be one of the large challenges moving forward. As that European hospitality study suggests, people in general are drawn to a new experience. And in the world of theme parks, even for a well-received new attraction, that newness wears off after 2 years. So there's a clock ticking here. I fully expect the Star Cruiser to be mostly full through summer. There will be a deep fan base of Star Wars fans interested in role-playing during these initial months, some of whom have previous experience with LARPing or cosplay at Comic-Con. Maybe the Star Cruiser will have some slow weeks during fall, just like the Florida resort in general, and then will fill to capacity over the winter holidays. But some time after that, about a year from now, will be the point to watch to see how Disney not only promotes this adventure, but also to see if the public's interest in it begins to change. I will add this. As the Star Cruiser is the first attempt to create a deep role-playing installation at a Disney resort, I do wish it had been a one-day standalone activity with no overnight element. So much of the discussion right now, as mentioned, is about price, and that makes it difficult to see how engaged general theme park guests might be in such an experience. If the Star Cruiser is successful, there will be other role-playing adventures attached to other parks. If this is not successful, there won't be, or at least not for a while. I suspect that Universal is watching this experiment closely, with an eye toward creating something for Potter. And I also suspect that executives at the Disney Resort over in California might be mulling over possibilities for a role-playing adventure arranged to the MCU. Presently, there are two significant reasons why the Star Cruiser might not connect with a theme park audience and prove financially successful. The first is a desire to engage role-playing at all. Maybe as C.B. Wood suggested all those years ago, the majority of theme park guests still simply want to be a passive audience for a good show and aren't that interested in role-playing. But the other is price. If the Star Cruiser fails to attract critical long-term momentum because enough people over years aren't interested in role-playing, that would be a shame. But also one I could accept. Simply, people need to enjoy themselves in ways that are comfortable on vacation. And if enough theme park guests over the coming years aren't deeply interested in role-playing, so be it. But if the Star Cruiser fails to attract critical long-term momentum because of the type of product built, a 2-night hotel experience is too costly, that is an entirely different type of loss, as that would prevent other types of themed role-playing experiences from being created. Experiences that might, perhaps arranged as one-day standalone adventures without a hotel stay, better match the realistic financial limits of many resort visitors. So we're at an interesting juncture for the world of theme parks, one that is testing how an audience wants to engage with the images they first saw on the big screen. Disney Plus is pursuing projects that allow an audience to spend far longer periods of time with characters from the Marvel and Star Wars universes. And down at the Florida resort, the Star Cruiser is experimenting with how guests will interact with a physical recreation of the Star Wars universe. In ways these changes are happening quickly. A couple of years ago, Rise of the Resistance at 18 minutes was seen as a game changer in the Disney parks, one that lowered guests into a physically immersive world. And now, in 2022, the Florida resort is experimenting with an adventure that is nearly 2 days long. As you probably know, masks are no longer required at the American Disney parks, either outdoors or indoors, except while on enclosed transportation such as buses, the monorails, or even that box truck transport from the Galactic Star Cruiser over to Batuu. Even though masks are no longer required, I expect voluntary mask usage to draw down gradually over many months, especially in California. Over the past 2 years, California and Florida have simply developed different cultures relating to pandemic safety. Last I was in the California park, I counted 44% of those outdoors voluntarily wearing masks and far more indoors. On either coast, likely for months you'll find groups of guests wearing masks and groups of guests without them. No matter which group you fall into, you'll fit in. Like most people, I'm hopeful that we're now through the worst of this pandemic. We have vaccines, we also have a growing number of drug therapies, which, though not perfect, are becoming an effective tool against COVID. I recognize that there's still the possibility of another spike due to a new variant, and like driving with your high beams on down a mountain highway at night, I think it's fairly easy to see the road immediately in front of us, less so to see what the road is like a mile ahead. So after 2 years of this pandemic, I think we're finally going to have some good months ahead of us with far lower case rates. But also, this pandemic has thrown us many curves. Just in case next fall and next winter aren't as smooth as we all hope, you might want to get in whatever trips interest you while the situation is good. And the reduction in COVID rates has also allowed the parks, both in California and Florida, to open up more toward normal operations. This is the type of good news that's easy to celebrate, a set of outdoor spectaculars set to finally reopen. Let's start with California. The World of Color fountains at DCA have been refurbished, the lagoon has been refilled, and the show will reopen after a 2-year closure on April 22nd. Across the plaza, Disneyland will reintroduce a far more sophisticated fireworks show than the one it has used during the period of limited capacity this past year. On April 22nd, the park will reintroduce Disneyland Forever, which will play weekends during spring, while Mickey's Magical Mix will continue on weekdays. Lastly, also on April 22nd, Disneyland will reintroduce the Main Street Electrical Parade, 50 years after the shimmering floats first moved through the park in sync to the Moog offerings of Baroque hoedown. The parade will feature many familiar floats, including a smoke-breathing dragon, but the parade will have one new, or rather reimagined, unit. The multi-float final unit, once known as To Honor America, has been remade to feature dozens of characters from films, mostly recent films, including Encanto, Moana, and Raya and the Last Dragon. The figures are arranged in the style of Disney concept artist Mary Blair. And there's a tonal shift here in how Disney is representing itself in this parade. The original finale float was essentially a flowing American flag and eagle, which, among other things, signaled Disney's identity as an American company. In the 1970s, when this parade first premiered, though Disney had offices around the world, the studio and the parks only existed in the U.S. Today, Disney is a multinational corporation with parks and film production facilities around the world. The visual suggestions in this particular replacement highlight how some long-standing national elements of the Disney company are giving way to multinational images. From personal observations, I have always found the Florida resort to have far deeper explorations of America's history and identity. It's one of the elements that I find fascinating about Disney's work in Florida. From Liberty Square to the American Adventure to all of the resort areas arranged to recreate the lovely natural terrains of the United States, from the Pacific Northwest to the Florida Keys to the southern bayous of Port Orleans. That element of national exploration and national identity is a large part of the Florida resort. I don't see any of this changing. But it's a smaller part of the identity of the California resort. If anything, the California resort is far more focused on the various cultures of California. But I point this shift out here as Disney very consciously is reconfiguring how it presents itself to the world, and this replacement is a fairly good example of that exchange. Beyond this, in California, Fantasmic with Roiling Fire and Dragon Dreams will reappear on the island on May 28th, just in time for summer. Out in Florida, the watery stage where Fantasmic is performed has been refurbished and the moat has been refilled. The show will feature a new sequence. Exactly what is included in the new sequence has not been announced, but the revised poster for Fantasmic now features Aladdin's lamp, Moana's oar, and frozen fractals, suggesting that this new sequence will incorporate elements from these three pictures. This past month, Disney filed for a general construction permit for the Fantasmic Theater, likely to finish either performance or seating areas before the show reappears. The show in Florida has no reopening date. Disney tends to give about 2 months lead time, if not a little more, between these announcements and the actual reopening. So at this point, in terms of Florida, I think the earliest we'll see the revised Fantasmic show is summer, and maybe not even then. And lastly, it's no big secret that the two big productions unveiled last October for Disney World's 50th haven't drawn as much interest as the company hoped. The new fireworks spectacular over at the Magic Kingdom, Enchantment, consistently polls lower than the show it replaced, Happily Ever After. Fireworks and projection shows can be expanded and updated with minimal expense. But over at Epcot, the resort has a larger problem with Harmonious. I like the show, not as much as I loved Illuminations, but I very much like this show. In my opinion, it has two large drawbacks. First, the show itself has only a few good viewing angles. And second, the giant donut and taco barges during the day detract from the visual theme of international architecture and gardens, which is the unifying design strategy of World Showcase. As for the nighttime show itself, it too polls lower than Disney would like. In a recent survey, Disney asked guests a very direct question, quote, How would you rate your overall experience with Harmonious compared to your overall experience with Illuminations, Reflections of Earth? Would you say that Harmonious was 1. Better, 2. About the same, or 3. Worse? Questions like this aren't typically used to understand guest opinion. Disney already has a good sense of how much or how little guests like this show. Rather, questions like this are used to quantify how necessary it is to change an existing production. This is the type of data that executives can use to justify spending money to update a show that premiered only 6 months ago. The equipment used in Harmonious was extremely expensive, costing tens of millions, if not over $100 million. The equipment is not going anywhere, at least not for a while. And so this survey question suggests Disney is already looking at ways to update the show with 1 or 2 new song sequences, likely already in development. Right now, the films and even the songs in Harmonious match fairly closely the films and songs represented in Enchantment over at the Magic Kingdom. It would be good, I think, for Harmonious to differentiate itself more from the nighttime spectacular at the Magic Kingdom, and also move toward an ending that has a higher level of energy and concludes with a musical sense of optimism. How long these changes take to appear in the show, I have no idea. But I'm guessing that's exactly where we're going, and likely fairly soon. With that, we've looped through a number of significant changes that have happened this past month, from how Disney Plus is shifting more to longer programming directed at a slightly older audience, to how the Galactic Star Cruiser represents a new category of role-playing experience in the world of theme parks, to how the parks, both in California and Florida, are inching back to their pre-pandemic identities. And out here in California, while I've been recording, we've had a little rain. Typically, I record these episodes on Friday and Saturday, and last night, late Friday, we had a little rain. It was only a light sprinkle, but rain tends to wash some of the pollen out of the air. Hopefully that makes things better for the coming week, and for that I'm grateful. There's one other area from this last month that I want to talk about specifically: the changing way Disney positions itself as a lifestyle brand, as a company that moves beyond entertainment into other services, and how this may lead to some very interesting opportunities for us as fans and consumers. But that's a topic I want to save for when we have our next update at the start of April. And so aside from that, you are now entirely up to date. I'll be back next Sunday with a new episode that continues the story of the Sherman Brothers as their work with P.L. Travers on Mary Poppins moves toward some deep moments of tension. As you know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. Without subscribers, we would simply cease to exist. We do just 2 things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney studio and parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney company. If you enjoy these episodes, you can support our efforts by becoming a monthly Bandcamp subscriber. On Bandcamp, you'll find dozens and dozens of extra episodes, but the best reason to subscribe is to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can subscribe at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link in the show notes. So, until next time, this is Todd James Pierce.